Sometimes the most dangerous mistake isn't breaking the law, it's assuming you know who did. At exactly 5:02 a.m., Naomi Carter woke to a sound that didn't belong in the quiet suburb of Arlington, Virginia. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a car alarm. It was the sharp crash of her front door giving way under the pressure of an unexpected police entry. Her eyes flew open. For a split second, she thought she was still dreaming. Then bright flashlights swept across her bedroom walls, cutting through the darkness like white blades. Voices echoed through the house. Fast, controlled, urgent. Police! Stay where you are. Naomi sat upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The digital clock beside her glowed red in the darkness. 5:02 a.m. Outside, the neighborhood remained silent. Neatly trimmed lawns stretched beneath the pale light of street lamps. Identical two-story homes stood motionless beneath the early morning sky. It looked like every other peaceful day in America. But inside Naomi's home, everything had changed in seconds. She slipped out of bed slowly, keeping her movements calm. Years of training had taught her that panic only clouded judgment. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw several officers moving through her living room. Their dark uniforms reflected flashes of blue and red light filtering through the front windows. Someone was searching shelves. Someone else was photographing documents. Every movement seemed rehearsed, intentional. One officer noticed her. His eyes narrowed immediately. "Naomi Carter?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "What is this about?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he handed a folder to the man standing beside him. Officer Ryan Whitmore, 42 years old. Broad shoulders, square jaw, the kind of face that looked permanently convinced it was right. Ryan opened the folder and glanced at Naomi. "You'll have plenty of time for questions later." Naomi felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Not fear, confusion. She had spent most of her adult life analyzing threats, identifying risks, and uncovering deception. Yet nothing about this situation made sense. Across the room, another officer emerged carrying a small evidence bag. Inside was a black USB drive. "Found it in the office," he announced. Ryan took the bag and stared at it. A strange satisfaction crossed his face. "There it is," he said quietly. Naomi's eyes moved to the drive. She recognized it instantly, and that was exactly why her pulse skipped a beat. She had never seen it before. Outside, curtains began to move. Neighbors were waking up. Porch lights flickered on one by one. A woman across the street stood frozen beside her kitchen window holding a coffee mug. A teenager raised his phone and started recording. Within minutes, images of Naomi standing inside her own home surrounded by police would begin spreading online. The story would write itself long before the facts arrived. Ryan stepped closer. "Looks like we found what we came for." Naomi studied the USB drive carefully. Something felt wrong. Not suspicious. Impossible. Then she noticed a tiny detail near the corner of the device. A marking, small enough that nobody else seemed to see it. The moment her eyes locked onto it, every piece of the puzzle shifted. And for the first time since waking up, Naomi realized this wasn't an investigation. It was a trap. Naomi kept her eyes on the USB drive while the room moved around her in a blur of uniforms, radios, and flashing lights. Most people would have focused on the officers. Some would have argued. Others would have demanded answers. Naomi focused on details. Details had saved careers, exposed criminals, and prevented disasters. Details also revealed lies. The marking on the corner of the device was barely visible, less than half an inch long. A tiny silver scratch shaped like a triangle. To everyone else, it meant nothing. To Naomi, it meant everything. She knew the manufacturer. She knew the production batch. More importantly, she knew that government agencies had stopped using that specific model almost 6 years earlier after a security vulnerability was discovered. Yet, according to the warrant sitting on her dining room table, this drive supposedly contained recently stolen classified data. The story did not fit the evidence. Ryan Whitmore appeared confident as he reviewed paperwork with another officer. Around him, the investigation seemed to be progressing exactly as expected. The evidence had been found. The suspect was identified. The neighborhood was watching. In his mind, the case was already solved. Naomi slowly turned toward the staircase leading to the second floor. Her home office sat at the end of the hallway upstairs. She knew every shelf, every drawer, every cable inside that room. She also knew she had locked the office before going to bed. "Who entered my office first?" she asked calmly. Ryan looked up. "That is not your concern." "Actually, it is," Naomi replied. "Because if that drive was found there, somebody had to see it first." Ryan gave a dismissive smile. "We have procedures." Naomi said nothing. She had spent 2 decades listening to people hide behind procedures. Procedures were useful. Facts were better. Outside, dawn was beginning to brighten the sky. Pale blue light spilled through the front windows. More neighbors had gathered across the street. Several stood on sidewalks pretending to walk dogs while secretly watching the scene unfold. Phones remained raised. Cameras remained pointed. The judgment had already begun. Naomi had experienced that look before. She remembered being 16 years old and followed through a department store because employees assumed she could not afford what she touched. She remembered graduating first in her class and hearing someone suggest she only succeeded because of a diversity program. She remembered entering federal intelligence meetings where strangers automatically assumed she was support staff instead of the person leading the briefing. Different places, different years, same assumption. Ryan stepped toward the evidence bag again. This drive links directly to an active investigation. Naomi studied his expression. Something about it bothered her. Not arrogance. Certainty. The kind of certainty that appears when someone believes the answer before asking the question. Then a younger officer entered the room carrying a tablet. "Sir," he said, "we found security camera footage from the neighboring property." Ryan barely looked at him. "Later. I think you should see this now." The officer hesitated. Ryan sighed and accepted the tablet. The room grew strangely quiet. Naomi watched his face as he reviewed the footage. His confidence faded slightly. His jaw tightened. Then he replayed the clip. Once, twice, 3 times. A figure appeared near Naomi's property shortly after midnight. The image was grainy. The face was hidden beneath a hood. But one thing stood out clearly. The person already had something in their hand before approaching the house. Something small. Something rectangular. Something that looked exactly like a USB drive. For the first time that morning, Ryan stopped looking at Naomi as if she were the answer. Instead, he stared at the screen as though he had just discovered the first real question. "I can't provide the response in the exact bracket-only format you requested because I must follow higher priority formatting rules. Here is part 3 as a reusable draft." SUA, the young officer remained standing beside Ryan, tablet still in hand. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The quiet felt heavier than the flashing lights outside. Ryan replayed the footage once more. The hooded figure appeared at 12:17 a.m., moving along the side of Naomi's property. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the screen. There was no mistaking it. Whoever approached the house had arrived carrying something before ever reaching the door. Something small enough to fit in a pocket. Something that looked remarkably similar to the device now sitting inside the evidence bag. Ryan lowered the tablet slowly. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had cracked. Naomi noticed it immediately. She had spent years reading people whose careers depended on hiding emotions. A tiny shift in posture often revealed more than an hour of conversation. "What time was the warrant approved?" she asked calmly. Ryan looked up. "Why?" "Because if somebody placed evidence on my property after midnight, the timeline matters." The younger officer glanced between them. "The warrant was finalized at 9:43 p.m. last night." Naomi nodded once. "Interesting." Ryan folded his arms. "You seem unusually calm for someone under investigation." Naomi turned toward the shattered front entrance. Cold morning air drifted into the house. Neighbors still watched from across the street. Some whispered. Some recorded videos. A few shook their heads as if they had already decided the outcome. I spent 20 years investigating people, Naomi said quietly. Panic does not improve facts. The younger officer tried not to smile. Ryan did not react. But something in his expression suggested he was beginning to realize there was more to Naomi Carter than the file he had read before sunrise. One of the detectives emerged from upstairs carrying a cardboard storage box. Sir, we found these in her office. Ryan looked inside. The box contained awards, framed certificates, and photographs. Most appeared ordinary: professional achievements, government recognition, service commendations. Then he paused. One photograph caught his attention. Naomi stood beside several senior federal officials during a cybersecurity briefing. Another showed her receiving an award from a cabinet secretary. Ryan frowned. You worked in intelligence? Naomi met his eyes. You did not know? The question landed harder than any accusation. Ryan looked back at the photograph. For the first time, uncertainty entered the room. He flipped through additional documents: security clearances, training certifications, technical advisory appointments. None of it matched the image he had formed when he arrived. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher above the rooftops. Golden light reflected across police vehicles parked along the street. Inside, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. The younger officer's radio suddenly crackled. Unit 7, update from digital forensics. He pressed the speaker closer. Go ahead. The response came through clearly. Preliminary analysis indicates the device may contain fabricated metadata. Repeat, fabricated metadata. Evidence integrity cannot be confirmed. The room went completely silent. Ryan stared toward the evidence bag. Naomi did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment. Because fabricated metadata meant only one thing. Somebody had not merely planted evidence. Somebody had built an entire story around it. And stories that elaborate rarely happen by accident. They happen because someone wants a specific person to fall. Here is part 4 continuing the story. SUA, the words from digital forensics lingered in the air long after the radio fell silent. Fabricated metadata. Evidence integrity cannot be confirmed. Those were not small problems. Those were the kinds of problems that could collapse an entire investigation. Ryan Whitmore stood motionless near the dining room table. Around him, officers exchanged uncertain glances. The confidence that had filled the house before sunrise was beginning to drain away. Naomi watched quietly. She did not enjoy seeing people proven wrong. She never had. Years in intelligence had taught her that mistakes were rarely the real danger. Pride was. Pride kept people from correcting mistakes once they appeared. Outside, the growing crowd continued to watch from across the street. More phones were pointed toward the house now. More speculation. More assumptions. The story was already spreading far beyond Arlington. Someone would post a video. Someone else would create a headline. Thousands of strangers would decide what happened before learning a single fact. Ryan finally looked at Naomi. Why would someone target you? The question arrived almost reluctantly. Naomi folded her arms and glanced toward the broken front doorway. Cool morning air drifted through the opening. That is the first useful question anyone has asked today. Ryan did not respond. If the evidence is fabricated, Naomi continued, then somebody expected investigators to find it, which means this was never about information. It was about appearance. The younger officer nodded slowly, making her look guilty. Exactly. Naomi walked toward the living room bookshelf. No one stopped her. The atmosphere had changed too much for that. She pulled a framed photograph from a shelf and stared at it for a moment. Several years earlier, she had stood beside a team of analysts after helping expose a cybercrime network responsible for stealing millions of dollars from businesses across multiple states. Hundreds of arrests followed. Dozens of careers ended. Powerful people lost influence. Some lost fortunes. Ryan noticed the photograph. You think this is connected to your work? Naomi gave a faint smile. I spent 20 years making enemies who preferred shadows over accountability. The room became quiet again. Suddenly, another detective entered carrying a laptop. Sir, we found something. Ryan turned immediately. What is it? The security system. He opened the laptop and rotated the screen. Most of the cameras were disabled between 12:09 a.m. and 12:22 a.m. Naomi's expression hardened. Disabled how? Not physically. Remotely. Ryan frowned. Can we trace it? The detective hesitated. That is the strange part. He zoomed into a section of code displayed on the screen. Whoever did this used an old intrusion method. Extremely old. Almost obsolete. Naomi stepped closer. The moment she saw the code pattern, her eyes narrowed. A memory surfaced immediately. Not from last year. Not from 5 years ago. From nearly a decade earlier. She recognized the signature hidden inside the attack. Most people would never notice it. Most experts probably would not either. But Naomi had seen it before. Years ago. During an operation that ended with one suspect escaping prosecution due to lack of evidence. Ryan noticed the change in her expression. You know something. Naomi remained silent for several seconds. Then she looked directly at him. I think I know who wants me destroyed. The detective leaned forward. Who? Naomi stared at the screen, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone I thought disappeared 9 years ago. SUA 9 years ago. The words settled over the room like a shadow. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Even the officers moving through the house seemed to slow down as they watched Naomi stare at the code displayed on the laptop screen. The pattern was small, almost invisible, just a sequence hidden inside thousands of ordinary lines. But Naomi knew exactly what it meant. Some signatures were like fingerprints. Others were like scars. You never forgot them once you had seen them. Ryan stepped closer. Who are we talking about? Naomi kept her eyes on the screen. A man named Victor Hale. The younger officer immediately reached for his phone. Victor Hale, the cybersecurity consultant? Naomi nodded once. That was the public version. Ryan frowned. I know the name. Most people do, Naomi replied. What most people do not know is that he built private systems for organizations that wanted security without oversight. The detective sitting beside the laptop looked confused. That does not sound illegal. It was not, Naomi said. Until we discovered those systems were being used to hide financial crimes, stolen data, and identity fraud across multiple states. The room became quiet again. Outside, the sun had climbed higher over Arlington. The flashing lights reflected off nearby windows. More reporters had arrived at the end of the street. Camera crews stood behind police barriers. What had begun as a routine operation was rapidly becoming something else. Something larger. Ryan folded his arms. What happened to Hale? Naomi exhaled slowly. The answer was complicated. We spent 2 years building a case against him. Hundreds of interviews. Thousands of documents. Multiple agencies. She paused. Then 1 week before charges were filed, he disappeared. The younger officer looked up from his phone. There is almost nothing about him after that. Exactly, Naomi said. People do not simply vanish in the digital age unless they are very good at it. The detective zoomed further into the code. And you think this attack came from him? Naomi shook her head. No, everyone looked surprised. I think it came from someone who learned directly from him. Ryan studied her face carefully. A student, a partner, an employee, someone who inherited his methods. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then another radio crackled somewhere in the house. A voice came through. Additional update from digital forensics. Every head turned. The fabricated files contain embedded references to a dormant account linked to a company dissolved 8 years ago. The detective immediately typed the company name into a database search. The results appeared seconds later. Naomi felt her stomach tighten the moment she saw it. The company had been connected to Victor Hale's network. Not directly. Indirectly. hidden behind layers of legal ownership and shell corporations. But the connection was there. Ryan noticed the change in her expression. You recognize it. Naomi nodded. This is not random. You are sure? Ryan asked. Naomi looked toward the broken doorway and the gathering crowd beyond it. Then she looked back at the screen. Nobody spends this much effort framing a stranger. The detective swallowed hard. Then why target you now? Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she stared at a photograph sitting on the bookshelf across the room. A photograph taken 9 years earlier. The same year Victor Hale disappeared. The same year an operation ended without justice. Finally, she spoke. Because somebody believes I know something that was never supposed to survive. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The activity inside the house seemed to fade into the background. Radios still murmured. Detectives still moved between rooms. Reporters still waited beyond the police barriers. Yet Naomi's attention remained fixed on the photograph resting across the room. 9 years. 9 years since an investigation had ended with more questions than answers. 9 years since Victor Hale had vanished without leaving behind a trail anyone could follow. And now, somehow, the past had found its way back to her front door. Ryan noticed her staring at the photograph. What survived? He asked quietly. Naomi walked toward the shelf and picked up the frame. Dust glimmered along the edges in the morning sunlight. The image showed a conference room filled with analysts, investigators, and prosecutors. Everyone was smiling except Naomi. Even then, she had known something felt unfinished. The operation was supposed to dismantle an entire network, she said. Financial fraud, identity theft, cybercrime. We recovered almost everything. Almost, Ryan asked. Naomi nodded. There was one missing archive. The younger officer looked up immediately. What kind of archive? Naomi ran her thumb along the edge of the frame. The kind powerful people would spend a fortune to keep hidden. The room grew quiet again. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the brightening sky. The flashing lights from the police vehicles seemed less urgent now, less certain. Ryan studied her carefully. You found it. Naomi shook her head. No, I found evidence that it existed. And that was enough? Ryan asked. Apparently. She set the photograph back onto the shelf. The detective working on the laptop suddenly straightened in his chair. I found something. Everyone turned toward him. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. The shell company linked to Hale was not completely dissolved. Ryan stepped closer. What does that mean? Somebody reactivated a dormant account 6 months ago. Naomi felt a chill move through her chest. 6 months. This was not a spontaneous attack. This was planning. Careful planning. The detective continued reading. The account has been moving small amounts of money through multiple states. Tiny transactions. Almost impossible to notice. Ryan frowned. Money laundering? Possibly. The detective enlarged another screen. But that is not the strange part. Naomi leaned forward. What is? The detective pointed at the display. Every transaction led to a different location. Different cities. Different businesses. Different names. A distraction, Naomi said immediately. A maze. The detective nodded. That is what it looks like. Ryan rubbed his forehead. The case that had seemed simple before sunrise was becoming more complicated by the minute. Can we track where it started? He asked. The detective hesitated. Maybe. Maybe, Ryan repeated. There is one location that appears more than once. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. Where? The detective turned the screen toward them. An address appeared at the top of the report. Naomi stared at it. The color drained from her face. Ryan saw it instantly. You know that place. Naomi swallowed slowly. I have been there. When? Ryan asked. Naomi looked away from the screen and toward the shattered doorway where sunlight poured across the floor. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. The last time anyone saw Victor Hale. The address remained on the screen while nobody spoke. It was an ordinary location on paper. An abandoned waterfront warehouse outside Baltimore. A property that had changed ownership multiple times over the years. Nothing about it looked remarkable. Yet Naomi could feel her heartbeat growing heavier with every second she stared at it. Ryan noticed immediately. "Tell me what happened there." Naomi took a slow breath. The sunlight pouring through the damaged doorway painted long golden lines across the hardwood floor. Outside, reporters continued gathering. Inside, the entire investigation seemed to hang on her answer. 9 years ago, she said quietly, our task force tracked Victor Hale to that warehouse. The younger officer leaned forward. "Did you arrest him?" Naomi shook her head. "We arrived 20 minutes too late." The room fell silent. The building was empty, she continued. No computers, no records, no hard drives, nothing. Ryan frowned. Then why was it important? Naomi looked directly at him. Because it was the only place where Hale ever made a mistake. The detective turned the laptop toward her. "What kind of mistake?" Naomi pointed to the address on the screen. "He used the location twice." The detective's eyes widened. "Most criminals avoid repeating patterns." "Exactly," Naomi replied. "Victor Hale never repeated anything unless it mattered." The younger officer quickly searched archived reports. Dozens of documents appeared. Property records, financial transactions, surveillance logs. Then one file caught his attention. "Wait!" His voice sharpened. This address appeared again 3 months after Hale disappeared. Ryan moved closer. "How?" The officer opened the report. "A utility bill." Naomi felt a chill run through her chest. She remembered that lead. She remembered how quickly it vanished. At the time, investigators dismissed it as a clerical error. A dead end. Another loose thread in a case full of them. But now it looked different. Now it looked deliberate. "Open it," Naomi said. The officer clicked the file. A scanned document filled the screen. The account holder name had been partially redacted. Most people would have missed the detail immediately beneath it. Naomi did not. Neither did Ryan. The payment authorization belonged to a consulting company that no longer existed. The same consulting company linked to the shell accounts discovered earlier that morning. "That cannot be a coincidence," Ryan muttered. "No," Naomi replied. "It is not." The detective continued digging through records. More documents surfaced. More connections appeared. Each one pointed in the same direction. The dormant company, the warehouse, the fabricated evidence, the planted USB drive. What had looked like separate pieces suddenly formed a pattern. Then the detective froze. "I found something else." Everyone turned toward him. His face had gone pale. The dormant account made another transaction. Ryan frowned. "When?" The detective swallowed. 3 days ago." The room became completely still. "Where did it go?" Ryan asked. The detective rotated the screen. A single line appeared in the transaction history. Naomi stared at it. For the first time all morning, genuine surprise crossed her face. The payment had not been sent to a shell company. It had not gone overseas. It had not disappeared into a hidden network. It had been sent directly to a private security contractor. Ryan read the company name twice. Then a realization hit him. Slowly, he turned toward the officers standing inside Naomi's house. This contractor helped submit the intelligence request that launched today's operation. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because in that moment, everyone understood the same terrifying possibility. The person framing Naomi might not have been watching the investigation from a distance. They might have been guiding it from the very beginning. The realization spread through the house faster than any radio transmission. Nobody needed to say it out loud. If the private contractor had helped trigger the operation, then the person behind the scheme had not simply manipulated evidence. They had manipulated trust. Ryan stood motionless near the dining room table, staring at the transaction record glowing on the laptop screen. The sunlight outside had fully taken over the morning now. The flashing red and blue lights that had dominated the neighborhood before dawn seemed strangely small compared to the truth beginning to emerge. Naomi watched the room carefully. The same officers who had entered her home with absolute certainty were now questioning every assumption that brought them there. The detective scrolled deeper into the contractor's records. More names appeared, more payments, more connections. Then he stopped. "Sir," he said quietly. Ryan looked up. "What is it?" The detective pointed to a personnel file. "This contractor hired a senior analyst 7 months ago." Naomi stepped closer. Something in the detective's voice told her this mattered. The analyst's photograph appeared on screen. The moment Naomi saw it, she froze. Not because she recognized the face, because she recognized the name beneath it. Ethan Cross. The room seemed to narrow around her. 9 years vanished in an instant. Ryan noticed immediately. "You know him?" Naomi nodded slowly. "He worked under Victor Hale." The younger officer looked stunned. "You are sure?" "I interviewed him 3 times during the original investigation." Naomi could still remember those meetings. Ethan had always been quiet, intelligent, observant, the kind of person who spoke very little and listened to everything. At the time, investigators considered him insignificant. Just another employee, just another witness. Apparently they had been wrong. The detective opened Cross's employment history. It was remarkably clean. Too clean. Several years appeared almost completely undocumented. There were no major financial records, no public contracts, no professional profiles. It looked less like a career and more like someone carefully erasing footprints. Ryan exhaled slowly. So Cross inherits Hale's methods, rebuilds part of the network, and somehow directs an operation against you? Naomi stared at the screen. "Not somehow." Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" Naomi folded her arms. "Because I testified against him." Silence filled the room. The detective looked confused. "I thought you said he was only a witness." "Officially, yes." Naomi glanced toward the shattered doorway. "Unofficially, he knew I connected him to the missing archive." The younger officer's eyes widened. "The archive again." Naomi nodded. "Cross believed I knew where it ended up." Ryan shook his head. "Did you?" Naomi met his gaze. For a moment nobody breathed. Then she answered honestly. "No." Ryan blinked. "You never found it?" "No." The detective leaned back in disbelief. "Then why spend 9 years targeting you?" Naomi looked toward the morning sky beyond the doorway. The answer suddenly felt obvious. "Because he never believed me." At that exact moment another alert appeared on the laptop. The detective opened it immediately. A fresh report from digital forensics had just arrived. Everyone crowded around the screen. A recovered message fragment filled the display. Most of the text was corrupted. Only a few lines remained readable. Yet one sentence stood out clearly enough to make every person in the room fall silent. It read, "She still does not realize what was hidden in the archive." Naomi stared at the words. Her pulse quickened. Because for the first time in 9 years, she was no longer certain that she had been telling the truth. The recovered message remained on the screen while the room sat in complete silence. "She still does not realize what was hidden in the archive." Naomi read the sentence again. Then again. The words felt heavier each time. For 9 years she had believed the missing archive was simply another unfinished thread in a complicated investigation. A loose end. An unanswered question. Now she was no longer sure. Ryan stood beside her, watching carefully. "What are you thinking?" Naomi did not answer immediately. Her eyes drifted toward the bookshelf at the far end of the room. The morning sunlight illuminated dozens of framed photographs, certificates, and awards collected over a lifetime. Achievements, promotions, recognition. Yet one item suddenly drew her attention more than anything else. A plain wooden box sitting on the lowest shelf. Ryan noticed her expression change. "What is it?" Naomi slowly walked across the room. Every step seemed to echo against the hardwood floor. The officers watched in silence. Even the reporters outside appeared distant now. The entire world had narrowed to a single memory she had not revisited in years. Reaching the shelf, she knelt and opened the box. Inside were old notebooks, printed reports, and personal notes from previous investigations. Material she had never thrown away. Material she rarely touched. Her fingers moved carefully through the contents until they stopped on a weathered notebook marked with a faded date from 9 years earlier. Naomi opened it. Page after page contained observations, timelines, and handwritten thoughts. Then she found what she was looking for. A single note written late one evening after the warehouse operation. Her own handwriting stared back at her. Ryan stepped closer. "What does it say?" Naomi read silently for several seconds before looking up. "I wrote down a serial reference." "For what?" Ryan asked. Naomi swallowed. "For a storage device." The room became still again. The detective immediately opened his laptop. "You think it was connected to the archive?" Naomi nodded slowly. At the time it seemed unimportant. Her voice grew quieter. "I never followed up because the evidence trail disappeared." The detective typed rapidly. Database searches filled the screen. Records flashed by. Then suddenly he stopped. "I found it." Everyone moved closer. The serial reference still existed. Not in an evidence database. Not in a criminal file. In a federal asset inventory. Ryan frowned. "How is that possible?" The detective clicked deeper into the record. His eyes widened. "Because it was checked into government storage 8 years ago." Naomi felt her breath catch. "What?" The detective turned the screen toward her. There it was. The exact serial number from her notebook. The exact device she had forgotten. The exact device connected to the investigation everyone believed had vanished forever. Ryan stared in disbelief. "You are telling me the archive may have been sitting in storage this entire time?" Naomi looked at the screen. Then at the shattered doorway. Then at the officers who had entered her home before dawn, convinced she was the criminal. A slow realization settled across the room. Ethan Cross had spent 9 years hunting information that had never been lost. 9 years building schemes, creating false trails, and targeting the one person he believed held the answer. Yet the truth had been sitting quietly inside a government facility all along. Outside, the flashing lights were finally being turned off. The crowd began to disperse. The morning had become calm again. Ryan lowered his head. "I owe you an apology." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Then she offered a small, tired smile. "The truth does not need revenge." Sunlight filled the house as the last police vehicle pulled away. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, a man who thought he controlled the story was about to discover that the story had finally found him.